So welcome everyone. This may be really ironic, but I'm excited about the topic for tonight. And the topic is depression, working with depression as part of our Buddhist practice. And I like to give disclaimers at the beginning of talks to let you know that I'm not a specialist in depression. I'm not a therapist. But I have had to deal with bouts of pretty serious depression in my life. And thankfully, I've had these tools for this practice and how to work through them, how to work through these bouts, and they've been extremely helpful. So I'm going to share some of these awarenesses and tools with you tonight. And doing it, of course, from a Buddhist perspective. So I looked up depression. You know, back in the old day, we used to look in what was the dictionary that everybody used to use? Webster's or Merriam, and now it's dictionary.com. Times have changed. But dictionary.com says that depression is a state of feeling sadness, gloom, and dejection. And it stems from the Latin word depresso, which means pressing down, which I thought was so apropos because when we feel depression, doesn't it kind of feel like something's pressing down on us, that there's a heavy weight on top of us? So in today's world, one of the most oppressive and debilitating kinds of suffering is depression. And a lot of us in this room can attest to that. The World Health Organization notes that mental ill health is increasing and predicts that 1 in 4 persons will develop 1 or 4 mental disorders during their lives. That's a lot. And depression has also been shown to cause or be a precursor to increased illness. So the stress from depression will lead to greater illness. So you have a higher incidence of illness if you're depressed. By the year 2020, depression is expected to be the highest ranking cause of disease in the developed world. Americans are prescribed antidepressants at a higher rate than ever before, and it just keeps increasing. The latest stats that I got was that 11% of Americans over 12 years of age are now on antidepressants, taking some prescription antidepressants. 23% of all women aged 40 to 59 take antidepressants. And I'm making up that has to do with menopause. And I can tell you that menopause sucks. At least it has. Can I get a hallelujah? I've heard some women say, oh, I've had no problems with menopause. And I'm like, that's good karma for you. Good karma for you. Anyhow, yeah. And depression is rising at alarming rates with teens. So you hear about all kinds of recent studies coming out how teens are suffering from the highest rates of suicide and depression. And there are many, many reasons why, at least postulations as to why. But in Buddhism, depression is listed as a form of suffering, a form of dukkha. If you remember in Buddhism, the 4 Noble Truths, the first noble truth is the truth of dukkha, that suffering exists, that it's inherent in all human lives. We can't avoid dukkha. And in Buddhist terms, it's related to and called sorrow, lamentation, despair. So in the Buddhist texts. So, you know, he was talking about this back then. And according to the Buddha, we're all of us are prone to feeling these different negative mind states from time to time. So this is B. Alan Wallace. He's an expert in Tibetan Buddhism. He says, according to recent studies, it seems highly unlikely that depression arises purely from chemical imbalances, except in rare cases of vitamin deficiencies, stroke, and so on. So according to Wallace, most depression has stress-related psychological causes. So basically what I'm hearing him say is that causes and conditions that cause stress in our lives is feeding or creating the ground for depression to arise, for the sorrow, lamentation, and despair to arise. And let's face it, the truth is life can be rather hard, can be difficult at times. It's not always a cakewalk. Plus, a lot of us are dealing with ramifications from stress caused by not only modern day life, we could really go into that, but also from the trauma that we experienced from childhood. Perhaps we had some neglect or lack of love growing up, lack of healthy attachment. Now they're saying healthy attachment helps develop a healthy brain so that we can get through life with confidence and without a lot of stress. So if we had a really healthy attachment developed as babies, as young children growing up, then our brains developed in a way that we can handle stress when it arises. But most of us didn't get the consistent, loving, cared, held, 24/7 that we needed as babies growing up in order to form this healthy attachment. So we have a lot of stress and trauma from our childhoods, most of us, not everyone. And Gabor Mate, he's a physician specializing in neurology, psychiatry, and psychology. If you come Sunday, he's one of my crushes that I play on the video. But he says that we need this consistent attachment and consistent love and nurturing growing up regularly without any trauma in our childhoods or our adult life in order to become happy and emotionally healthy adults. Oh, geez. Or close to that, That's kind of scary. So our chances of depression increase if we've had any traumas, inconsistent upbringing. If our parents were depressed, we have a much higher chance, or any of our family members, we have a much higher chance of depression if they were suffering from family history of depression. Life stressors, and as adults, if we've experienced discrimination, divorce, abuse, neglect, or any traumas in our adulthood as well. Kind of sounds bad, doesn't it? But it sounds good too, and that it at least lets us know that we are almost, we're set up in this space to be depressed. Society sets us up to a certain degree. It doesn't give us the resources it needs for us in order to deal with stress when stress arises, because their society is stress-laden. So when we don't have the resources of this wonderful upbringing, and then stress hits without the resources, we get more traumatized, right? And then the more traumatized we get, the more stress, the more prone we are to depression once again. Here's a quote that I really liked. Butch Hancock, he was from Texas. He remembers, life in Lubbock, Texas taught me two things. One is that God loves you and you're going to burn in hell. The other is that sex is the most awful, filthy thing on earth and you should save it for someone you love. And we're laughing at this, but didn't we get messages like this? So on top of all the trauma and everything else we experience, we get all these mixed messages from society that really sets us up to be depressed. So it's not your fault if you've ever experienced depression. Anyone here ever experienced trauma in their childhoods? Oh, okay, no. The liars over here, no. Anybody here experience trauma in their adulthood? Okay. Stress? Yeah, I'm still trying to prove the point, right? Anybody here ever suspect their parents or primary caregivers to possibly be suffering with forms of stress? Okay. That's it. It's not your fault. Yeah, so it's normal to be depressed. If you're not depressed, I'm worried about you. I'm just kidding. So that's why we're here, right? We're here because this practice is supposed to help us free ourselves from this condition that we're in. So when I was 28 years old, I went through the worst depression of my life. I had depression as a child growing up, bouts of depression and a lot of anxiety. But at 28 years old, luckily I'd had a strong practice for several years before this happened. And I had just had my second child, a beautiful daughter, and then I fell into the deepest, darkest depression. The feelings of despair and anxiety and fear and angst. And I was exhausted. I was wanting to sleep all the time, and I had this newborn baby to take care of. And I kept telling everybody I'm so sick and I'm depressed, and nobody would believe me. And I was going to doctor after doctor, and they were saying, you have a bacterial infection, you have a viral infection, you have this, you have that. I swelled up and gained 30 pounds after having a child, and I was barely eating any food. And I was suicidal, very suicidal. It was the toughest time of my life. For 7 months I went through this. The darkest, deepest night of my gloom, I decided I was going to kill myself. I couldn't take it anymore. I had thoughts and desires to kill my baby, which were really intense. And I woke up my husband and I said, please help me. And I was crying. I said, I'm going to kill myself. I can't do this anymore. And he said, we just go to sleep and you'll feel better. And so I realized that wasn't going to work. That wasn't much help. So I got up and I went into our medicine cabinet and I pulled out every prescription drug we had. Painkillers, muscle relaxers, everything I could find. And I lined them all up on the table. And I sat there crying as I was ready to take them all. And there was one voice in my head that was screaming, take them, take them, take them all. Does anybody know about that voice? There was another very, very soft whisper, kind voice that was saying, just follow your breath. Follow your breath. You know how to do this. You'll get through this. I'm here for you. It was a whisper, the screaming, take it, and this little whisper. And I kept leaning towards the whisper. And I was following my breath, following my breath. At one point I got up and ran out in the middle of the night down the street trying to keep myself away from those pills. And eventually I got through the night between following my breath and I obviously got through the night because I'm sitting here telling you the story. Anyhow, after they figured out what was wrong with me and put me on a prescription for low thyroid condition, about a year later, it takes a long time to recover from this illness, I met an old psychiatrist friend at the gym where I used to work out. And he said, where have you been? I haven't seen you in so long. So I told him, the nightmare I went through. And he asked me what my numbers were, the thyroid numbers. And I told him, and he just he was floored because he worked in a psychiatry hospital. And he said that the numbers that I had are the ones you usually pick up in a newspaper and you read of someone who killed their family and then themselves. So this practice saved me. Not only is depression incredibly hard to bear, but depending on its severity, it can definitely interfere with everything in your life, your ability to work, to sleep, to study, to eat, to enjoy the normal pleasures of life. Not to mention the havoc it wreaks in your relationships. But one of the hardest things to deal with depression is a sense of shame and isolation. Because depression is not acceptable in our society. Do you think it's acceptable? Nor is it hardly ever talked about. So there's a sense of shame. And then when you talk to your loved ones and wanting to get their support, they say well-meaning things like, well, just get out there and exercise more. You'll feel better. Or pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you'll anybody know what I'm saying? Does anybody have another well-meaning sentence that was really not helpful?
Snap out of it.
Snap out of it. Right?
Too attached to your story.
You're too attached to your story. Oh, yeah. So there's all these well-meaning things that people are, they really want to help, but actually what it does is it causes you to feel even more shame. It makes you feel even worse. Because then you start thinking there's something inherently wrong with me. Right? There must be something wrong with who I am because these snap out of it's aren't working. So according to Buddhist psychology, major depression is not regarded as a mental illness, but rather a symptom of underlying mental afflictions with the roots in craving, aversion, and delusion. I talk about those three roots a lot. These mental afflictions or kilesas, all the mental afflictions come from one of these three. And they give rise to suffering for ourselves and others, right? So first we get stuck in one of these kilesas, and then we get somewhat depressed or anxious about one of them. And then what happens is we start acting out from this place, which sometimes is unskillful, and then we get even more depressed. So it's this loop. If we look for afflictive psychological processes within the Buddhist context that may result in depression, we'll find the so-called 5 hindrances or obscurations play a crucial role. So did anybody ever take the 5 hindrances class I taught a few years ago? Yeah. So if you did, you'll understand how these 5 hindrances play a huge role in depression. So I'll go through them briefly and then talk briefly about how they feed into depression. The first is craving and attachment to pleasant experiences or pleasure. So we want to feel good. And we want things to go our way. Yesterday I had a really rough day. It was like one thing after another. I mean, you couldn't even write a funnier script about what was going wrong. One thing after another was going wrong, even to the point where my cat sat on me and got poop on my hand. And my pants, my nice pants. But that's just one of like 10 things that went wrong yesterday. And I was like, this is hilarious. I can't even believe I started laughing. But there's a part of us that thinks everything is supposed to go perfectly and well all the time. Because the human mind wants everything to go just well all the time. And when it doesn't, we crave things to be pleasant. We crave things to go well. And when they don't, we get upset, which leads to the second hindrance, which is aversion. Anger, hostility, resentment. So when things aren't going our way or things aren't pleasant, then we start to have aversion towards the way things are going. Then the third is sloth and torpor. You know what I'm talking about? Tiredness, laziness, just desire to sleep, escape, dullness. The mind feels like a big cloud. So that's sloth and torpor. And when we get really, a lot of stress, dealing with all this stress and this aversion and depression, things not going our way, we can get really exhausted. Then the fourth one is restlessness and anxiety. At some point, we're going to get so sick of this whole process that we want to just bust right out of our skin and dive out of our lives, and just we want it all to, we get really restless and anxious. And then along with restlessness and anxiety, the fourth hindrance comes remorse and guilt. Isn't that wonderful? And then the fifth one is debilitating uncertainty and doubt. How many in your deepest depression feel doubt? Right? So to the Buddhists, this is the Buddha quote. As long as these 5 obscurations are not abandoned, one considers himself as indebted, sick, in bonds, enslaved, and lost in a desert track. Isn't he describing depression? Getting stuck in depression? So I can look back at times when I've been depressed and clearly see, even when I'm going through a little bit of depression, how the 5 hindrances take over the mind and I can get engulfed with them. So your job is to be aware of the 5 hindrances when you're there. Noticing when there's aversion there, opening up to aversion. Not letting it take hold, not getting identified with any of these 5 hindrances. And when you're lost in them, that's when it really, so they start feeding each other. Like I was describing, you get really tired and depressed, and so you're slipping your life away, and then you start to doubt yourself and think that, something's wrong with me, and then the more doubt you have, the more anxiety and restlessness you have, the more anxiety and restlessness you have, the more desire you have to feel good again, you want to be happy again. The more you want to be happy again, the more aversion you have to how it is right now, and it just keeps feeding itself. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So these 5 hindrances are really important to be able to see how they operate within us while we're going through a rough time. The recipe, antidote to our suffering, if any of you have just taken the intro to Buddhism class or the Four Noble Truths class, the antidote is the 4th Noble Truth. Does anybody know what that is? Yay! The Noble Eightfold Path. So that's the antidote to our suffering. And the Noble Eightfold Path consists of 3 divisions, which you're trying to cultivate within yourself. The first one is the ethical or moral division, or maybe it's the second one, the wisdom division. So you're trying to develop more wisdom through your awareness and waking up and your intentions and your thoughts. And then the third one is cultivating our practice, the concentration division. So if you don't know much about the Noble Eightfold Path, I would say that this is, if you want a really strong antidote, please study the Noble Eightfold Path. It works. So one of the biggest complaints I hear from people who are depressed is the almost constant negative ruminating that's going on in their minds. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Right. And the mind can grab a hold of something and start worrying or fretting or regretting or remembering or rehashing. And this ruminating, this looping can drive a person crazy and causes even more depression. And a lot of it is, so it's often along with some self-limiting beliefs that are really degrading, really self-beat up, like, I'm not good enough. What are some other, just one short sentence, things that you've heard your mind saying when you're in one of these difficult states? This will never change, or this will never end.
You don't deserve peace.
I don't deserve peace.
It's not worth it anyway.
It's not worth it anyway. Is that it? Am I the only one?
There must be something wrong with me.
There must be something inherent, and wrong with me.
Nothing ever works out.
Nothing ever works out. Good.
Everybody else seems to really have it together.
Everybody else has it together, but me.
It's all my fault.
It's all my fault. Yep.
Everyone's against me.
Everybody's against me. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. I should have. Oh, she should on herself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never make it.
I'll never make it. We could just do this for an hour, right? Yeah. My mom went through a really painful, depressing period, and she kept saying, I'm never going to get better. It's never going to get better. Another one is I'm all alone. So these self-defeating, self-beat-up beliefs run quietly, sometimes under the surface, and sometimes they're raging and screaming to the point where they cause so much aversion that we want immediate relief in whatever way we can get it. In our practice, these beliefs, these statements are considered delusions. They're considered ignorance. They're not true. They're beliefs we made up at some point in our life when our basic human, physical, emotional needs were not being met. So at some point in our lives, we didn't feel like our needs were being met, so we made up that we weren't worthy or we weren't deserving or whatever, and we just keep repeating this like a mantra. Whenever things get rough, our mantras, we sling our mantras out and we start repeating them over and over again. Right? So the first thing we want to do is be able to see these limiting mantras when we pull them out and not necessarily believe them. We don't want to believe them. Through mindfulness training, one learns to overcome the habitual tendency of these negative rumination by seeing it, choosing not to feed it, not to believe it. You learn that you don't have to buy into these statements or these feelings. You learn that you're not your beliefs or your feelings. They just arise and pass away like your experience when you're meditating, right? Everything's arising and passing away. You can label them as visitors that come knocking on the door. Oh, here's self-pity. Here's sadness. Here's whatever. Here's the story, I'm not good enough. They're just old mind habit patterns that are playing themselves out. They don't mean anything. And the more you don't believe them, the less you feed them and the less power they have over you. That's the good news. At the depression of this, at the center of this depression is this big I, the big me, the my depression, my situation. This is mine. And the more you're identified with this me that's depressed, the more depressed you're going to be, and the harder it's going to be to break free from this. This separate I is also considered a delusion in Buddhism. We need to awaken from this sense of separate self. It's called anatta, the no self. And it's not saying that you don't have a self. It's saying to not be identified with this sense of separate self. Sometimes depression is an altruistic call for a shift in your life. Perhaps you're in a relationship that doesn't promote your well-being and you need to get out of it. Or perhaps it's an altruistic call to shift your worldview away from the materialistic realm and into a more spiritual window, or perhaps it's calling you to live your life more authentically or change the people you surround yourself with. Who knows? So depression is a call to get some more resources in your life, to make a shift in your life. Right? And you have to listen to that call and say, okay, what is it wanting? What is this call for? Buddhism provides a connecting practice, wholesome values, and a way of life that support this shift to a more authentic life. This is a great practice in order to make these shifts. And you want to meditate. Meditate. Everybody repeat after me. Meditate. Meditate. You ever get tired of me saying this? Meditate! And I could just go on and on about all the numerous studies that show that regular mindfulness meditation actually reorients the brain activity from the depressed, stressed out centers of the brain to the prefrontal areas of the brain that are associated with positive feelings, and also the parts of the brain that regulate fear and stress and depression. So you're actually developing the parts of the brain that would have been developed if you had healthy attachment. Isn't that great? So you didn't get healthy attachment, you're not screwed for the rest of your life. You can meditate and cultivate and develop these parts of your brain. But it takes regular daily practice. This is why Buddhist monks who practice meditation for hours a day are considered the happiest people in the world when they did fMRI studies on them, because they meditate a lot. So the more you meditate, the happier you have a chance of being. Of course, you probably don't want to sit there and meditate the whole day every day and not engage in the world, but practice some more. And this is why therapists are regularly, I don't know if they write scripts for it, but you want to meditate. tell people to meditate. So I could go on and on about what's really important with this part of your practice, but one of the qualities that's so important when you're working with depression or about is first to bring compassion to yourself. Today we did compassion as the little child. Whatever compassion practice works for you, there's so many of them out there, to really, bring compassion to yourself when you're going through this rough time. Bring empathy to yourself. Compassion is like a close friend who can listen to you without getting lost in your story or getting depressed along with you. That's what compassion is like. And that's what we need when we're having a hard time. We don't need someone else to get lost in our lostness. We want to be curious. Curiosity allows us to see that these waves of depression come blowing in and they eventually blow back out. They're impermanent. Anicca. They're temporary. They're not. So these waves, they're difficult, but they're not lasting. Does that make any sense? Usually, they're not lasting. And when we see the ebbing and flowing and the beginning and ending of depressive waves, we develop confidence to be able to deal with them. Oh, okay, I can deal with this. It's only temporary. It's not going to last every minute for the rest of my life. So the other thing we want to cultivate is this attitude I talked about in the meditation. The attitude of openness, curiosity, connection, love, and compassion. To when we turn towards our depression or whatever is arising with curiosity, what does it feel like? What does it look like? What is it calling for? What is it asking for? What resources do I need right now? We'll learn that maybe right now I need to go spend some time with a good friend, someone who's, some people. Maybe I just need some more quiet time. Or maybe I need to start getting massages or whatever the resources you need in order to build yourself back up. Sometimes our suffering becomes so unbearable that it's really unskillful to turn towards our suffering. This is important to know. Because a lot of times we think, oh, well, I'm a good meditation practitioner. I should be able to turn towards my depression and suffering. But sometimes we'll get lost in it if it's so severe. So then it might be skillful to distract ourselves, to give our minds a chance to get more balance, like maybe watching a good comedy movie, or taking a nice bubble bath, or taking a break from it all. You don't always have to turn towards this grueling depression and open to it completely. So you want to do that in waves too. Open to it and then give yourself a break and then open to it. And of course, the healing efficacy of the healing, loving abode practices. Loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. If you've taken that class series that I teach, those are powerful practices. And finally, I want to say that study by psychological science reported that people who were the happiest, had the fewest signs of depression, had strong ties to family and friends. They were most committed to spending regular time with them. So the very happy people were more highly social, they were more extroverted, more agreeable, and less neurotic. So if you want to be happier, you might want to schedule in some regular time with some good, loving, supportive people in your life. This is Philip Moffat, Dancing with Life. It's a great book. He says, Ajahn Sumedho teaches that to understand dukkha, you must be willing to stand under suffering. Similarly, Helen Luke said you must be willing to receive suffering in the manner of standing under a waterfall. Both of these descriptions point to the capacity of fully, consciously receiving life as it is, to voluntarily receive the distress of life and mindfully bear it with consciousness and compassion is a critical threshold for all spiritual development. And there's so much more to say, but I'll leave it up to you in the discussion. Thank you for listening and your attention.